What if the very foundations of our political order contain the seeds of their own destruction? For decades, I have observed a peculiar phenomenon. Liberal democracy celebrates principles that ultimately undermine its own possibility. This is not mere philosophical speculation, but a careful diagnosis based on reading the great texts with the attention they deserve. The architects of modernity promised to solve the ancient problems of politics through rational institutions and universal rights. Yet their solutions have created new contradictions that threaten both political stability and the philosophical life itself. Today we must examine how liberal democracy's deepest commitments generate the very crises it cannot resolve. The classical philosophers understood something about political life that our contemporaries have forgotten, that every regime carries within itself the principle of its own dissolution. When we read Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Politics with proper care, we discover that they anticipated precisely the difficulties that plague modern democracy. Their insights remain hidden to those who approach these texts with modern assumptions about progress and perfectibility. Chapter 1: The Principle of Universal Rights and its Self-Contradiction. Liberal democracy rests upon the assertion that all human beings possess equal natural rights. This principle appears generous and enlightened, yet careful examination reveals an internal tension that may prove fatal. When we trace this doctrine to its sources in thinkers like Locke and Rousseau, we discover that they sought to solve the problem of political authority by grounding it in the consent of naturally free individuals. But this solution immediately encounters a paradox. If individuals are truly free by nature, by what right does any political authority constrain them? The social contract theorists answered that rational individuals would consent to government to protect their rights more effectively. Yet this reasoning assumes that individuals can judge what serves their true interests, an assumption that experience constantly contradicts. Moreover, the principle of universal rights demands that society treat all preferences and ways of life as equally valid, provided they do not harm others. This sounds tolerant, but it makes impossible any public distinction between noble and base, wise and foolish, virtuous and vicious. When a political order cannot publicly affirm standards of human excellence, it loses the capacity to educate its citizens or inspire their loyalty. The ancients understood that political community requires shared conceptions of justice and the good life. A regime that treats all conceptions as equally valid effectively affirms that none are true. This leads to the corrosive relativism that eats away at democracy's moral foundations. The doctrine of rights also creates perpetual conflict between competing claims. If everyone possesses equal rights to pursue their conception of happiness, what happens when these conceptions clash? Liberal democracy promises procedural solutions, majority rule, constitutional protections, judicial review. But procedures cannot resolve fundamental disagreements about justice and the good. They can only postpone or disguise them. When citizens lose faith in shared standards of truth and justice, democratic procedures become mere power struggles. The majority rule principle, supposedly neutral, actually favors whatever coalition can mobilize the most votes. This transforms politics from a quest for justice into a competition for dominance. The minority's only protection lies in constitutional rights that judges interpret according to their own philosophical commitments. Thus the promise of popular self-government yields to judicial oligarchy exercising unaccountable power over the most fundamental questions of political life. Chapter 2: The Fatal Divorce Between Fact and Value. Modern liberal democracy depends upon a philosophical foundation that Max Weber called the fact-value distinction. This doctrine holds that science can determine what is, but not what ought to be. Questions of value become matters of subjective preference rather than objective knowledge. This separation promised to resolve religious and philosophical conflicts by removing them from public discourse, confining them to the private sphere where they could not threaten political stability. Yet this solution creates deeper problems than those it seeks to solve. When political life can no longer appeal to objective standards of justice, It loses its claim to moral authority. Why should citizens obey laws that rest merely on subjective preferences rather than genuine knowledge of right and wrong? The fact-value distinction makes democratic deliberation meaningless, since there remains nothing objective to deliberate about. If all values are equally valid, then political discourse becomes mere rhetoric designed to mobilize sentiment rather than serious inquiry into justice. The ancients approached politics differently. Plato and Aristotle assumed that questions about justice and the best regime were matters of knowledge, not mere opinion. They believed that careful philosophical investigation could discover objective truths about human nature and political life. This made possible genuine political science, systematic inquiry into the principles of good government. Modern political science, constrained by the fact-value distinction, abandons any attempt to identify the best regime. It can describe how institutions function but cannot evaluate whether they serve human flourishing. This leads to the paradox of a political science that has nothing meaningful to say about politics. When academics cannot defend objective standards of political excellence, they contribute to the relativism that undermines democracy's legitimacy. The fact-value distinction also makes impossible any coherent account of human nature. If science can tell us only what human beings are like factually, but not what they ought to become, then we have no guidance for education or character formation. Liberal democracy thus produces citizens who may be well informed about facts but lack wisdom about how to live. This creates the phenomenon Alexis de Tocqueville observed in Democracy in America: democratic citizens who are knowledgeable about many things but wise about none. The separation of fact and value ultimately serves the interests of those who benefit from moral confusion. When ordinary citizens cannot appeal to objective standards of justice, they become vulnerable to manipulation by elites who understand how to exploit their preferences and prejudices. The promise of value neutrality yields to the reality of value imposition by those sophisticated enough to recognize that the fact-value distinction is itself a contentious philosophical doctrine. Chapter 3: Historical Progress as Self-Refuting Dogma. Have you ever noticed how liberal democracy's faith in progress undermines its own foundations? The modern belief in historical progress assumes that humanity advances through time toward greater enlightenment, freedom, and prosperity. This doctrine serves as liberal democracy's theodicy, justifying present sufferings by promising future redemption. Yet careful examination reveals that progressivism contradicts the relativism that liberal democracy also embraces. If all values are relative to particular cultures and historical periods, how can we maintain that movement from one period to another constitutes genuine progress? Progress implies objective standards by which we can judge some arrangements superior to others. But objective standards are precisely what liberal democracy's commitment to relativism denies. The progressivist narrative typically portrays the movement from ancient to modern political forms as liberation from superstition and tyranny. Yet this account ignores what the ancients achieved that moderns have lost. Ancient political communities cultivated virtues like courage, moderation, and practical wisdom that democratic societies struggle to maintain. The classical philosophers understood that political life aimed at human flourishing rather than mere satisfaction of preferences. Their insights into the requirements of good government remain superior to modern theories that reduce politics to power struggles or market mechanisms. The dogma of progress also creates what we might call temporal chauvinism, the assumption that later must be better. This prejudice prevents serious engagement with ancient texts, since readers approach them already convinced that modern improvements have rendered classical insights obsolete. Such an attitude makes impossible the kind of learning that occurs when we allow great thinkers to challenge our fundamental assumptions. When I encourage students to read Plato or Aristotle carefully, I notice that those most committed to progressivist assumptions experience the greatest difficulty understanding what these philosophers actually taught. Moreover, the belief in automatic progress encourages dangerous complacency about contemporary arrangements. If history naturally tends toward improvement, then present institutions require little defense or careful preservation. This attitude leaves democratic societies vulnerable to demagogues who promise to accelerate progress through radical transformation. The 20th century's totalitarian movements succeeded partly because they appealed to progressivist hopes while destroying the traditional restraints that protected human dignity. The progressivist account also obscures the cyclical character of political life that ancient historians like Thucydides and Polybius understood. Human nature remains constant across historical periods, which means that political communities face recurring challenges that cannot be permanently solved through institutional innovation. The decline of regimes results from internal contradictions and human folly rather than external obstacles that progress can overcome. Understanding these patterns requires the kind of political wisdom that comes from studying how past communities faced similar challenges. Chapter 4: The Modern Solution That Became the Problem. The founders of modern political philosophy believed they had discovered the key to solving politics' eternal problems. Instead of relying on virtue and wisdom, which seemed rare and unreliable, they would construct institutions that channeled human selfishness toward beneficial outcomes. This approach promised to make good government compatible with ordinary human nature rather than dependent on exceptional character. James Madison's famous argument in Federalist 10 exemplifies this strategy. Since faction cannot be eliminated without destroying liberty, wise institutional design must control its effects through extended republics and separation of powers. Yet the modern solution has created problems the ancients never faced. When political institutions assume that citizens will be selfish and design mechanisms to accommodate that assumption, they encourage the very behavior they seek to manage. Constitutional systems that expect the worst from human nature rarely inspire citizens to be better than their expectations. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where democratic politics becomes exactly as sordid and unprincipled as the institutional framework assumes it will be. The classical approach recognized that political life necessarily involves moral education. Citizens required formation in virtue not merely to serve the community's good, but to achieve their own flourishing as human beings. Aristotle's Politics argues that the city exists not merely to preserve life but to enable the good life, a life of virtuous activity that realizes human potential. Modern democracies abandon this educational function, leaving character formation to private choice and market forces. The result is moral chaos rather than the neutral proceduralism that liberalism promises. Furthermore, the modern emphasis on institutional mechanisms diverts attention from the character of those who operate these institutions. The American founders assumed that Republican government would attract and reward public-spirited leaders who understood constitutional principles. Yet institutional incentives alone cannot guarantee that such leaders will emerge or prevail. When democratic politics rewards pandering over statesmanship, it attracts candidates who excel at manipulation rather than governance. The separation of powers, designed to prevent tyranny through institutional competition, often produces gridlock that frustrates necessary action. Meanwhile, the administrative state grows to fill the vacuum left by legislative paralysis, creating unaccountable bureaucratic power that operates outside constitutional constraints. This development reproduces the arbitrary rule that modern constitutionalism sought to prevent. The market-based approach to politics also reduces citizens to consumers shopping among competing policy proposals. This framework undermines the deliberative engagement that democratic theory celebrates. When citizens approach politics as customers seeking maximum personal benefit, they lose the capacity for the broader perspective that effective governance requires. The ancient understanding of citizenship as participation in ruling and being ruled in turn becomes impossible within consumer democracy. Chapter 5: The Tension Between Philosophy and Democratic Faith. Consider how your own relationship to truth shapes your political commitments. Liberal democracy claims to protect intellectual freedom while simultaneously requiring citizens to affirm democratic values. This creates a fundamental tension between the philosophical commitment to follow arguments wherever they lead and the political need for shared beliefs that sustain democratic institutions. Philosophy by its very nature questions all received opinions, including those upon which political communities depend. Yet democratic societies require widespread acceptance of certain principles, human equality, popular sovereignty, individual rights, that philosophical inquiry might conclude are false or incoherent. The conflict between reason and democratic faith mirrors the ancient tension between philosophy and the city that Socrates exemplified. Athens executed Socrates partly because his questioning threatened beliefs necessary for political solidarity. Modern democracies face similar challenges when philosophical inquiry undermines democratic orthodoxies. Today's universities demonstrate this tension clearly. They proclaim commitment to free inquiry while enforcing ideological conformity on questions touching race, gender, and inequality. Professors who question progressive assumptions face persecution reminiscent of what dissidents experienced in ancient cities. The Academy's betrayal of intellectual freedom reveals democracy's inability to tolerate genuine philosophic independence. The problem runs deeper than academic politics. Democratic theory assumes that rational deliberation among equals will produce good outcomes. Yet philosophy suggests that most human beings lack both the intellectual capacity and moral character required for such deliberation. If Plato is correct that genuine knowledge remains accessible only to those with rare philosophical natures, then democratic equality rests on a false premise. This creates what we might call the democratic paradox. Democracy works only if most citizens possess wisdom, but wisdom cannot be democratically distributed. The classical philosophers addressed this problem through the noble lie, beneficial beliefs that promote political health even if philosophically questionable. Plato's Republic suggests that just cities require myths about human nature and divine favor that philosophers cannot literally affirm. This solution protects both political stability and philosophical inquiry by maintaining appropriate boundaries between public doctrine and private understanding. Modern democracy rejects such deliberate separation, insisting that the same principles should govern both public life and private reflection. This demand for transparency creates impossible expectations. When philosophers cannot publicly express their deepest insights without undermining political order, they face a choice between intellectual integrity and civic responsibility. Many resolve this tension by abandoning serious philosophical investigation altogether, conforming their thinking to democratic requirements. Others retreat into academic specialization that poses no threat to popular beliefs. Both responses impoverish intellectual life and deprive society of wisdom it desperately needs. The few who maintain genuine philosophical independence risk marginalization or persecution. Democratic societies thus reproduce the conflict between Athens and Socrates, though in more subtle forms. The irony is that liberal democracies' promise to protect intellectual freedom depends upon philosophical foundations that serious intellectual investigation tends to undermine. Chapter 6: When Truth Becomes Politically Dangerous. The relationship between knowledge and political order presents philosophers with permanent dilemmas that democratic theory cannot resolve. When truth serves political stability, philosophers can speak openly and contribute to public discourse. But when genuine insights threaten popular beliefs or institutional arrangements, wisdom requires careful consideration of whether, how, and to whom these insights should be communicated. This need for prudent communication reflects not cowardice but recognition that truth and political health sometimes conflict in ways that require delicate navigation. Consider how contemporary social science research on human differences creates political difficulties. Studies suggesting genetic influences on intelligence, behavioral tendencies linked to ethnic background, or natural foundations for traditional gender roles challenge egalitarian assumptions that sustain liberal democratic legitimacy. Researchers who publish such findings face ostracism, professional punishment, and public vilification. The response reveals democracy's inability to acknowledge inconvenient truths that might undermine its founding principles. The classical tradition handled such tensions more wisely. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle understood that different levels of truth served different purposes and audiences. Popular education required inspiring stories and simplified principles that motivated virtuous behavior. Philosophical investigation pursued more complex and sometimes disturbing insights about human nature and political possibilities. This differentiation protected both social order and intellectual integrity by recognizing that not all truths benefit all people equally. Modern democracy's commitment to transparency and equality makes such differentiation impossible to defend publicly. The principle that all citizens deserve equal access to information becomes a demand that all truths be publicly available regardless of their political consequences. This creates the paradox of societies that proclaim their commitment to truth while punishing those who discover or communicate inconvenient truths. The result is not greater honesty but more sophisticated forms of deception. Academic disciplines develop elaborate methodologies for avoiding dangerous questions or presenting threatening conclusions in politically acceptable forms. Intellectual life becomes an exercise in speaking truthfully while saying nothing that might offend democratic sensibilities. This corruption spreads beyond universities to journalism, policy research, and public discourse generally. The question of who deserves access to potentially dangerous truths involves recognition that human beings differ in their capacity to handle disturbing insights responsibly. Some individuals possess the intellectual sophistication and moral character required to consider radical possibilities without becoming cynical or destructive. Others need protective beliefs that enable constructive participation in political life without deep philosophical reflection. A wise approach to education would recognize these differences and provide appropriate instruction for different types of students. Yet democratic equality prohibits such discrimination, insisting that identical opportunities must be available to all regardless of natural differences or demonstrated capacity. The problem extends to the special responsibility that comes with superior understanding. Those who grasp truths that could destabilize political order bear responsibility for considering how their knowledge affects others. This might require restraint in publication, careful attention to audience, or presentation of insights in forms that minimize harmful consequences while preserving essential truths for those capable of understanding them. Chapter 7: Returning to Classical Wisdom as Democratic Necessity. The path forward requires courage to acknowledge that our current crisis stems from abandoning classical insights about political life rather than from failing to implement modern principles more thoroughly. The great texts of antiquity offer resources for understanding democracy's contradictions and developing practical wisdom for navigating them. Yet approaching these texts productively requires abandoning the prejudice that treats ancient authors as historical curiosities rather than potential teachers whose insights might surpass our own. When we read Plato's Republic without assuming that democratic equality represents moral progress, we discover sophisticated analysis of how different regime types shape human character and political possibility. Plato understood that democracy faces inherent tendencies toward disorder that can only be managed through careful attention to education, law, and institutional design. His insights about democratic psychology remain more penetrating than contemporary political science that focuses on mechanisms while ignoring the human souls that operate them. Aristotle's Politics provides equally valuable guidance for those willing to approach it as potential wisdom rather than historical artifact. His analysis of constitutional forms reveals why mixed government provides better protection for human flourishing than pure democracy or other simple arrangements. More importantly, his understanding of political life as naturally oriented toward virtue offers an alternative to the interest-based politics that reduces citizens to competing factions. The classical approach to political education deserves special attention from those concerned about democracy's moral foundations. Ancient philosophers understood that political communities necessarily engage in character formation whether they acknowledge it or not. The question is not whether politics will shape souls, but whether it will do so wisely or carelessly. Democratic societies that abandon conscious moral education do not achieve neutrality, they simply allow market forces, popular culture, and ideological movements to shape character according to their own logics. A return to classical principles would recognize education's political importance while maintaining appropriate respect for intellectual freedom. This requires distinguishing between formation in civic virtues that enable political participation and indoctrination in particular policy preferences or ideological commitments. Citizens need development in qualities like prudence, justice, courage, and moderation that serve democracy regardless of specific political disagreements. They also need sufficient philosophical sophistication to recognize the difference between genuine wisdom and clever manipulation. Such education cannot be purely private since political communities depend on citizens possessing certain qualities. Yet it cannot be purely public since philosophical inquiry requires independence from political pressure. The solution involves creating institutional arrangements that protect spaces for serious education while ensuring that such education serves rather than undermines legitimate political order. This might require reviving something like the classical distinction between liberal education for future leaders and practical training for ordinary citizens, though adapted to democratic rather than aristocratic conditions. The study of great books provides one model for such education. When students engage seriously with texts by Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, and other classical authors, they develop intellectual habits that improve their capacity for democratic citizenship. They learn to distinguish between strong and weak arguments, to consider multiple perspectives on complex questions, and to appreciate the permanent challenges that face all political communities. Most importantly, they encounter examples of serious thinking about fundamental questions that inspire their own philosophical development. Conclusion. The contradictions within liberal democracy are not accidental flaws that better policies might correct, but necessary consequences of its foundational principles. Recognition of this sobering truth opens the possibility for wisdom rather than mere cleverness in addressing our political difficulties. The classical authors understood that every regime carries the seeds of its own transformation, and that political health requires constant attention to the tensions between competing goods rather than faith in final solutions. Those who would preserve what remains valuable in democratic institutions must abandon the progressivist illusion that historical development automatically produces improvement. Instead, we need the kind of practical wisdom that comes from studying how past communities faced similar challenges, learning from their successes and failures rather than assuming our superior enlightenment. This requires the intellectual courage to question fundamental assumptions about equality, rights, and progress that contemporary education treats as beyond dispute. It also requires the moral courage to pursue truth even when it leads to uncomfortable conclusions about human nature and political possibility. The choice before us is ultimately between the comfort of familiar illusions and the adventure of genuine philosophical inquiry into the permanent questions of political life.